We are now going to begin Kings and Generals, the English Civil War series, also known as the War of the Three Kingdoms. and, yeah, so we're no stranger to this, mainly the characters involved in this era, from King Charles, Cromwell, Fairfax, etc. Mainly because we're familiar with this from Historia Civilis's Trial of King Charles two-parter, which we covered many, many months ago. And it's going to be really cool to revisit this era and learn about the, military aspect of it and the battles that took place and the strategy and etc. That's actually what I'm really looking forward to, because I feel like Historia Civilis covered the political landscape incredibly well, as he always does, and Kings and Generals one of the best people to depict battles. And yeah, overall, I really want to quickly say, I always put the link to these videos in the description down below. It is always the first link you will see. And if you like any of my commentary or any of my thoughts or my videos, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and really help support my small but humble channel grow. With that said, without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch the English Civil War by Kings and Generals.
Welcome to another installment of the full-length Kings and Generals documentaries. Today we're delving into one of the most pivotal and tumultuous periods in British history, the English Civil War, also known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. This tumultuous conflict, which raged across the 17th century, was marked by intense battles, deep-seated religious strife, and a web of complex political problems that tore a nation apart, from the blood-soaked fields of Edgehill to the besieged city of York, and from the epic showdowns at Marston Moor to the siege of Oxford. It was a war that pitted brother against brother, father against son, as opposing forces fought for their vision of England's future. The battle lines were often drawn along religious beliefs, adding a layer of intensity to an already heated struggle. But the English Civil War was not just a religious war, it was a social and political powder keg waiting to explode. The monarchy, led by King Charles I Stuart, clashed with Parliament over issues of power and taxation. This political turmoil set the stage for a nation divided, and the consequences would reshape England forever. Join us as we unravel the dramatic and complex tapestry of the English Civil War, exploring its battles, religious strife, and political problems that forever altered the course of history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. That helps immensely. The Stuart dynasty came to power in England when the childless Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, and was succeeded by King of Scotland, James VI, who then also became James I of England. This reign united the realms of England, Scotland, and Ireland under one monarch for the first time, and saw an increase in the popularity of divine right, the God-given authority of a monarch to rule as he wished, unhindered by his nobles or people. After 22 years on...
That's something I always found very interesting about, England, the UK, and whatnot, is how they even early on to, all the way back to, Richard the Lionheart, while he was out fighting the Crusades, his brother John was such a bad ruler that they needed to impose the Magna Carta, I believe is what it's called, upon him, which was to kind of help limit the king. And, this limitation of the monarchy is something that kind of was really prevalent, around here, even before other nations kind of jumped in, right? Especially, I think, with their constitutional monarchy, something that endures even now. The UK has a royal family still, which is just really interesting. Though, obviously, I don't think some have called them just figureheads, not as powerful as they once were, but, it is just something really interesting how the UK, this island before most other places, really did kind of put a stamp in limiting the absolute power of the monarchy and kind of got a head start from other places in Europe. That was something that always interested me, and even one of the... Is it the only place in Europe, or one of the few places? No, wait, no, I think Sweden still has a royal family, but one of the few places, like, you know, that still has that. So, I don't know, I always kind of found that very interesting in terms of just the limiting power of the king, as it were, because, you know, usually when we think of kings, we think of, like, absolute power, right? But there's a limit to that, and that's something really interesting. Like, when we were covering Historia Civilis's, you know, King Charles series, just seeing the process of Parliament and how it all works with the king, I don't know, I just find it all very interesting, the whole political situation of the UK.
On the throne, during which momentous events such as the sailing of the Mayflower and Guy Fawkes' gunpowder plot took place, King James died in March 1625 and was succeeded by his second son, who ascended to the throne as Charles I. A scholarly-oriented man with a penchant for hunting, it immediately became clear that Charles had inherited his father's enthusiasm for divine right, and began acting in ways which profoundly angered influential factions in his country, the most important of which being Parliament.
Yeah, didn't he just not call Parliament? And he basically, like, was trying to have a sole rule and just get rid of Parliament, basically not calling them or consulting them at all? Which is wild, right?
Today, the British Houses of Lords and Commons are the governing institutions of the United Kingdom. But in the mid-17th century, this was not yet the case. The king still had executive decision-making authority, and his decree was the only means by which Parliament could legally convene. However, by the mid-1600s, the Houses had gained significant de facto power, such as the ability to raise taxes far more effectively and smoothly than the king himself, making it hard for English monarchs to operate without parliamentary approval. Upon ascending to the throne in 1625, the outwardly Protestant Charles married Henrietta Maria, the staunchly Catholic sister of France's King Louis XIII. While this was at first viewed as a shrewd diplomatic move, Maria's fervently pro-Catholic actions made the predominantly reformed English despise her. This religious dimension of the royal parliamentary divide was made worse by a number of factors, both internal and external. In mainland Europe, the 30 Years' War was raging without end. Many in England, and particularly in Parliament, wished to take up arms in order to prevent the Catholic Counter-Reformation from snuffing out their Protestant brothers, but Charles would not do so in a direct fashion. The meagre attempts in 1625 and 1628 of Charles to intervene at Cadiz and the Siege of La Rochelle respectively were blundered and only increased tension between the king and his parliament. Even worse than this was the increasing influence of William Laud, the intrusive Bishop of London, who advocated an anti-Calvinist sect of Protestantism known as Arminianism. This denomination rolled some Christian practices back closer to those of the Roman Catholic Church, and was viewed as yet another sign that Charles I was dangerously friendly to the hated Papists. All of these factors gradually ratcheted up the tension between Parliament and the monarchy. In short, it was making England a powder keg. More tangible issues were also at the heart of the Gulf, the most prominent of which was a growing opposition of the propertied classes in Parliament to the absolute rule of their monarch. The first Parliament called by the king in 1625 got off to a bad start on this front because of that most enduring of issues, taxes. Usually, Parliament would grant a new monarch permission to...
It's always taxes. Man. But, this just reminded me, there's an interesting film. Man, I think it's called Cromwell. And it's from the I don't know, maybe... When was it? Cromwell. 60s and maybe 50s, 70s, or around that time. and it stars Sir Alec Guinness, also known as Obi-Wan Kenobi. There are some clips on YouTube, like you can look up, like King Charles enters Parliament or whatnot. I've only seen some clips of it, but it seemed like a really cool film, mainly some of the King Charles stuff, and yeah, I definitely recommend it.
Customs duties, called tonnage and poundage, for an entire reign. But for Charles, they only gave such permission for 1 year. Parliament did grant levels of funding and taxation that would have been adequate in the past, but that was woefully inadequate when taking into account inflation and other costs. With Parliament continuously unwilling to grant sufficient funding, Charles began to raise money by his own means. Money was borrowed, with the crown jewels as security for repayment. Tonnage and poundage customs were collected regardless of parliamentary approval, and, most annoying to those affected, so-called forced loans were imposed on Charles's wealthier subjects. Overall, Charles raised over £250,000, but these measures caused anger and resentment. Many gentlemen refused to pay and were imprisoned, while others hindered the actions of local collectors and were similarly jailed by royal decree without trial. Because this method of imprisonment was normally only used when the state was in exceptional danger, Charles's use of it was viewed as abuse. When Parliament was
I think some people even were even like accusing Charles of tyranny, right? And you can definitely see that as he is trying to take just the power, right? Kind of undermining Parliament, and you can see that it seems like, especially when we're watching the Historia Civilis video, that he definitely obviously believed in the divine right to rule, that, you know, he was kind of chosen by God, and that as a king, that he almost had to never play second fiddle to anybody. And yeah, that definitely didn't help. He didn't seem like the compromising kind of man, especially earlier on. And I think that probably undid him. That's probably a factor, especially at this point in English history, where, you know, Parliament, granted, it's not as powerful as it will become, but it is still something that is growing in influence, and something that you kind of have to somewhat be working with, and he just doesn't want to compromise or, you know, work with them. I think that's probably the biggest one of the biggest personality flaws, character flaws that didn't help him in the long run. I'm not sure what the general consensus is of... Oh my goodness, sorry. I'm not sure what the general consensus is of Charles as a person, whether people like him or not in history. I don't know, he seems like quite the interesting fellow. Definitely flawed, but in his own way, his like audacity, especially in terms of like sticking it to Parliament, is actually kind of a funny trait, especially when we get to the trial stuff, and he essentially starts trolling everybody by who accuses me or whatnot. I don't know. Also, if I remember correctly, he essentially got like the Scottish to invade England, right? When he had basically lost the war, he essentially got another force to invade, which is something that resonated with me as like, oh my gosh, like, this man is... I don't know. What's the general consensus? Feel free to let me know. Like, is he... How's history viewed him? Because with some figures in history, obviously, we kind of know about, like, of their lasting legacy, like Darius, for example, King Darius. Apparently, a lot of people viewed him as cowardly for not fighting Alexander or losing to him, which is wild to me, but, you know, I'm interested in seeing how, especially, like, the modern-day British view him. Like, what's his legacy, or how he's viewed by through the modern lens. Feel free to let me know.
And again in 1628, a representative named Sir Edward Coke authored the Petition of Right, a document which set out a list of specific liberties which Charles would be absolutely forbidden from infringing. Amongst other things, Primary concerns were the illegality of arbitrary imprisonment and tax collection without parliamentary consent. In desperate need of parliamentary approval for funding, the king eventually accepted this document, but it is widely believed that he simply believed he was just reaffirming age-old liberties and was not conceding anything new. One of the main proponents of the petition was a staunch opponent of the king called John Pym, who would later become a parliamentary leader. Tensions escalated further when in 1629 a dispute about continuing royal customs collection was viewed by Parliament as an illegal contradiction of the Petition of Right. When the exasperated king ordered Parliament to adjourn, members held the Speaker, John Finch, in his chair so that the session could not formally end. He was held there long enough for resolutions against Charles's religious reforms and his collection of royal duties to be read out, a slight which was too much for the king. So on March 10, 1629, Charles I dissolved Parliament and arrested some of the ringleaders who had been behind the unrest, inadvertently making them martyrs and providing a rallying cry for those who opposed the absolute rule.
Again, like, especially with things like this, trying to take more power, even if you do work towards that, I feel like it's something you kind of have to ease into if you're gonna try to. I'm not sure the process of how you could, but like it's something that you can't just instantly change off the bat, right? Like he really did just essentially just try to like right here just get rid of them all at once. And again, like, yeah, definitely, especially if you're like on Parliament's side, their perspective, this guy is just being tyrannical and, you know, just kind of doing whatever he wants, and he's not compromising. He doesn't seem to even want to. And a guy who can't be reasoned with, if you're dealing with like an enemy who won't listen to reason, essentially, it's like, well, the only other way now is through force, and you can kind of see why. Again, I'm not sure if the consensus, if this is all Charles's fault. It feels like that to me, that this is all Charles's fault, that the war happens, but, you know, he definitely didn't help with the tension, especially him escalating it.
With the would-be cash cow Parliament disbanded, the king made peace with his foreign enemies and embarked on a period of sole rule. To his supporters, it was the personal rule, but to his enemies, it was the more sinister-sounding 11 years tyranny. There is a general assumption that this decade-long period must have been very evil by its nature. While many occurrences within these twilight years of peace directly led to the strife of the 1640s and 50s, it was not nearly as horrific as it's often portrayed. In England, personal rule began quite positively. While hardcore Puritans, radical Protestants who were convinced that the Reformation was only half done, thought that so-called high church Arminianism was the devil's work, the common man was not as opposed. Many ordinary people responded quite positively to the more formal approach to religion and readily embraced William Laud's moderate reforms at the beginning of the 1630s. Even Henrietta Maria became more docile, and it's clear that the personal rule was a happy time for the royal family in a personal sense. The Queen even gave birth to a child named Charles in May of 1630, a child who 3 decades later would be King of England in his own right. Younger Charles's birth was supposedly celebrated with great enthusiasm across all 3 kingdoms that the Stuart dynasty held sovereignty over, with bonfires lit in the baby's honor. It must have been...
This is an aspect that interests me, that he's already mentioned with, like, you know, how Ireland, Scotland, and England are kind of united in a sense. Though, like, I was operating with the knowledge of Historia Civilis, who kind of portrayed Scotland, especially during the war when Charles goes and essentially tells them, convinces them to invade, you know, England, which he had lost, that they were their own, still kind of their own foreign thing. So I'm wondering how united they are at this point, and if there's still some type of independence or some type of sovereignty, even though they're united on paper. You know what I mean? Or if later on that kind of unity kind of dismantles during the war. I don't know, but that's an interesting something interesting I'm thinking about at the moment.
In a happy time, which the royals were soon to look back on with sorrow. Later, as a widow in her native France, Maria described her feelings during the 1630s golden years, stating that, "I was the happiest and most fortunate of queens, for not only had I every pleasure the heart could desire, I had a husband who adored me." In continental Europe, the situation calmed somewhat during the personal rule, with the death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen in...
So we covered the kings and generals telling of, the 30 Years' War. Gustavus Adolphus's death shook me so hard. It caught me so off guard. And again, the 30 Years' War, what a wild but fun series. Feel free to check it out. It was actually one of my favorites we've ever looked into.
In 1632. Despite the Swedish king's reputation as a hero of Protestantism, the stalemate which ensued in the aftermath of his passing began to decrease the level of religious fear and paranoia felt in English society. Catholic dominance of the 30 Years' War during the 1620s had conjured a spectre of yet another invasion of the British Isles. With the stalemate, the threat deteriorated significantly, if it was ever possible at all. Meanwhile, Charles proved himself a champion of theatre, painting, architecture, music, and other aspects of high culture. Overall, a Capuchin priest named Father Cyprien reported back to his superiors in France that England is an abundant country and has no taxes. The inhabitants lead a luxurious life, far removed from the poverty of other places. As we will see, however, all was not well in England. Despite the Queen's increasing contentment, her zealous Catholicism was set to be an insurmountable problem for Charles. However much he tried, suspicious Protestant doubters would forever believe that Maria was attempting to use her position to slide England back into the grip of Rome. The Queen's many Catholic attendants who had accompanied her to England also proved themselves an issue, though not in Charles's own opinion. The king actually seemed to find the Catholic courtiers quite charming and found himself able to relax in their company. It is crucial to note in Charles's defense that he does not seem to have been going Catholic in any way, but had polarized interests which made it seem like he was. Specifically, he was tolerant of Catholics and an enemy to the extreme Puritans whom he and his new Archbishop of Canterbury saw as a threat. Upon ascending to that position in 1633, Laud began to overreach his authority and make everything worse for almost everyone who didn't share his own view on church matters. In addition to his Pope-light innovations to the Church of England, which convinced many Puritans that they were gradually being delivered to the Catholic Church on a silver platter, Laud also repeatedly prosecuted Puritans and opponents of episcopacy, the government of a church by bishops. One trial in 1637 became notorious for its brutality, involving three men named John Bastwick, William Prynne, and Henry Burton. They were pilloried for their defiance against Laud and had their ears cut off. Prynne had already suffered this punishment in 1634, and so his face was branded to bear the letters SL, or seditious libeller. This awful torture didn't have the effect Laud wanted.
My goodness. Yeah, kind of creating sort of martyrs, right? And also kind of showing them, like, okay, this dude, they already believe him to be encroaching upon the way they view things and trying to put them back to under the banner of Rome and the Catholic Church. So, especially with acts like these, does not endure one to showing that. In fact, probably just makes them martyrs and showing them, okay, this is how they are. Now we have to, I guess, fight essentially, right? So we don't lose it all. Yeah, some of their extreme retaliations, Laud and Charles, definitely just shows kind of again, to their enemies, a tyrannical side, and one where you can't achieve a compromise with these guys, you know?
And even moderate Protestants viewed the trio as martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
To them, it was becoming clear what was happening. Vile Catholics were being allowed to practice out in the open, while good, pious Protestants were persecuted. William Laud would soon after cause the spark which eventually set England ablaze. As the Venetian ambassador said of him, "This pest may be the one which will ultimately disturb the kingdom." Despite the largely peaceful and tranquil nature of Charles's early personal rule, the need for money was not diminished in the slightest. Unwilling to call another parliament to grant him subsidies, a number of creative measures were used to raise royal funds and at the same time bypass Westminster. Predictably, these clever legal tricks were viewed by Parliament as blatant petty cash grabs. The first of these measures was the selling of monopolies over a product or industry to one individual or company, exploiting a loophole in the law that forbade this. Despite raising over £30,000 per year for the king, this policy angered almost everyone else. Merchants excluded by the monopoly were annoyed because they couldn't trade, and regular labourers were annoyed because under monopolies, prices tended to rise in return for inferior products. Most infamous was the soap monopoly. Dubbed popish soap, this product supposedly blistered the hands of those using it, and because of the Catholic Manufacturing Board of the monopolist company, was said to blister the soul of Protestants as well. Charles also began reintroducing obsolete medieval laws in strange ways, reviving ancient fines on knights, people living in royal forests, and people building homes outside of designated areas in London. These fines were originally designed to coerce the fined individual into stopping a certain action, moving out of the forest for example. But Charles did not want the individual to cease the action because he wanted to keep fining them and bringing in the money. While this was a technically legal and clever use of the letter of the law,
yeah, all these loopholes he's going for, man. I'm telling you, something about Charles is that, like, again, he's literally the meme of the audacity of this man in what he does just to, I don't know. I find him oddly entertaining and kind of funny, like, unintentionally hilarious with just as a person. Man.
it went against the spirit of the law and was widely viewed as unjust. The king's most infamous fundraising measure was called ship money, which was reintroduced in its original form in 1634. It essentially served as an emergency financial levy in case of invasion, which allowed the king to collect money if there was no time to call parliament. Maritime counties would contribute funds for the construction of ships, which would then theoretically be used in defense of those counties. It was a fair system if employed as it was intended, but of course Charles I found a way to make it despised. Supported by the meddlesome Archbishop Laud, Charles extended the collection of ship money to inland areas as well, areas which were traditionally exempt due to their lack of a coast. Moreover, the collection of ship money was an emergency levying of funds, and there was no true emergency. However, the king got around this by having his lawyers bring up an old statute dictating that it was the king who determined what was or was not an emergency. So, the king got his money at first. When the ship money tithe was repeated year after year though, it became a massive problem to Parliament. After all, annual monetary tithes are in reality taxes, and taxes could only legally be raised with parliamentary consent, however much the king tried to legally state that it was not a tax. Naturally, all of this generated intense resistance from such individuals as John Hampden, whose actions in 1637 challenging ship money gave him a reputation as a champion of individual liberty. It also connected the parliamentary cause with property rights.
Okay, so according to my time code, this is where the first episode ends, and tomorrow we will get to the first battle, which is the Battle of Edgehill. So this was a good refresher on the political scene of what the heck's going on. And again, the audacity of this man. So yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow when we get to the first battle.